Okay. Well, first, a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today. You are at a webinar that is launching 3 new papers that are being published today from the Emerging Adult Justice Learning Community. And the webinar is called A Roadmap to Justice Reform. So I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker, John Lobb.
Thanks, Lael. My name is John Lobb, and I want to echo Lael's welcome to both the panelists in the webinar as well as those in the audience. I do want to remind everyone that we are going to be recording the webinar, so please be aware of that. In my brief remarks, I just want to provide a brief introduction to the burgeoning field of emerging adult justice and then describe for you the emerging adult justice learning community. The term emerging adulthood was coined in 2000 by Jeffrey Arnett, a developmental psychologist. Emerging adulthood is a distinct developmental stage, both theoretically and empirically, with a special focus on ages 18 to 25. A wide body of research from developmental psychology, life course sociology, has focused on emerging adulthood over the last 2 decades. A focus on emerging adults in the justice system presents challenges and opportunities. On the one hand, emerging adults have relatively high rates of crime and recidivism. It's also noteworthy that there are stark racial disparities regarding justice system involvement among emerging adults in the justice system. But at the same time, we know that emerging adulthood is often a period of change, and particularly changes in lawbreaking and ultimately desistance from crime. Back in 2016, a number of us, Vinnie Schiraldi, Lael Chester, Bruce Western, and myself, started talking about forming a learning community focused on emerging adults in the justice system. I remember Vinnie being very excited about this. He said, you could imagine, it would be 1899. We're sitting down in Chicago with Jane Addams talking about what the first juvenile court would look like. Well, in 2017, the Emerging Adult Justice learning community was launched with the support of the William T. Grant Foundation and the Open Philanthropy Project. The EAJLC, as it's known, is a practitioner-led effort coupled with a small cadre of researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and advocates from 6 sites that were either implementing new policies or programs for emerging adults or were seriously considering doing so, were invited to join the learning community. The idea was to create a space to share promising ideas and strategies for developmentally appropriate policies and programs for emerging adults in the justice system. Other goals included drawing attention to the unique needs of emerging adults, particularly those involved in the justice system, developing a research base on emerging adults in the justice system, and informing policy and practices in other jurisdictions not involved in the learning community. I encourage you to visit our website, eajustice.org, for more details regarding our work. I think one can ask, what was the field of emerging adult justice in 2016 compared to now? I'm encouraged by how much has changed, and I would like to think that the emerging adult justice learning community has been a major force in the field's development over the last 5 years. The field has not only been enriched by new policy and practice innovations in the 6 sites represented in the learning communities, but also have transcended the jurisdictional boundaries of these sites. Where we are now is a dynamic, growing array of policies and practices regarding developmentally appropriate responses to emerging adults in the justice system across many states. This webinar focuses on 3 such efforts. I'll now turn things over to my friend and colleague, Lael Chester.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for kicking us off today. And also thank you for your leadership at the learning community for the last 3 years. I want to start us off with a poll or 3 questions for all of you who are watching today. We are interested to know who we have, their background. We're interested to know, so whether you're a researcher, a practitioner, a policymaker, an advocate, or other. So if you want to go ahead and answer those, you can click on them. We're wondering on the second question is, where you live, is there any specialized practices there now? So the first is no, not yet. Yes, the courts, the probation, correctional units, or something else. It could be alternatives to incarceration program. It could be specialized diversion. We'd be curious to know. And then the last question is, if you do have specialized practices in the jurisdiction where you live, are they statewide or are they local in nature? In other words, sort of a certain court, a particular county, or does this not apply because you haven't, you don't have such a system set up yet. So just give people a moment to answer those, and a couple more votes coming in. Very democratic, don't want to cut it off, the votes. Seems like people are finishing up. Just give one more minute. The votes still coming in. I'm not going to be accused of not counting the votes. Okay, here we go. See what the results are. So hopefully you guys can see, nope, if I say share results, you can see. How you connected. So we've got really a great mix, a lot of others, but we've got advocates, policymakers, practitioners, and researchers on the call, on the webinar. 23, so about a quarter, don't yet have any specialized practice in their jurisdiction, but a bunch of you do, right? The majority of the folks here, and the winning practice that you have are courts, followed by probation, followed by correctional units, followed by other. That could be a big category, so that will be interesting. And if you do have a particular practice, it looks like about a quarter have statewide, and then about half are local, and then the rest is not applicable. So really interesting mix. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I wanted, as John mentioned, there's been an array of different kinds of innovative practices. And as this poll, right, certainly shows, it really has a big diverse spectrum. And this is particularly true that these new developments and innovations have been created in the last 3 years. I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about some of these innovations. So I see these innovations as falling within 2 buckets. There is the innovation of practice, right? And that's what we're talking about today. And in particular, we're talking about innovations in courts, probation, and specialized correctional units. And not only do we have the webinar, but at the same time, the learning community has written a paper on each of these, which is being published. And I'll get more information on that in a minute. But there are actually other innovations that we see across the country. These were the 3 that were the most popular when the learning community was certainly first looking into this. But some of the other ones are sort of shifting to community investment and community-based responses and away from sort of traditional justice system. We see that in a number of jurisdictions, and money, energy, focus going from the traditional justice system to the community. We see a lot of jurisdictions now exploring diversion. Some have specialized diversion, let's say, for the juvenile system, but it stops. If you turn 18, or in some few states still 17, you don't get access to that. So a lot of jurisdictions are saying, we can and should focus on that. There are also things like alternatives to indictment. There's different caseloads. One of these focus today is on probation, but interesting, we see a lot of states looking at the public defender's office. You have to be certified and go through special training to represent a youth in juvenile court. Adolescent development, understanding adolescent development and positive development framework is really, really relevant when you're 18, 19, 20, et cetera. And so some states and jurisdictions are saying, we should require training and certification before people just represent emerging adults in court. And then there's also things like specialized reentry, right? The sort of the farther end at the end of the process. I want to touch base though and just mention that There's also another whole world of innovation and reform in emerging adult justice, which is, again, not the focus of the webinar, but I want to put it out there so people are aware of it. And that is looking at changes in the laws and policies in really a systemic way. And in that, we see a number of different innovations. One is that a lot of states are questioning whether they have sort of the right idea for the upper age limit of the juvenile justice system, right? So we have 3 states are still 17, the rest are 18. But does that make sense with the recent research on emerging adulthood? And so Vermont is a state that's gone up, passed a law that will go to the 20th birthday. And there are about 7 other states that are in active play right now, considering changing their upper age limit of juvenile jurisdiction. There's also a lot of states that have specialized, sort of a special kind of hybrid system, often called a youthful offender statute, but the name is, I say that kind of loosely because every state has a different bend on it. But that those are interesting statutes, and many of them go over the 18th birthday. And they often include some of the confidentiality provisions, the more individualized rehabilitative approach to youth that are more noted on the juvenile side, and they apply that to emerging adults. There's also states are looking at expungement. Is it relevant to have a conviction at age 19 when you're 35? Right. And if you've moved on, you've grown up, you're on with life, should you be dealing with the collateral consequences for the rest of your life, right? So states are looking at that. And then the last category I'll mention on this sort of systemic policy arena is parole laws and resentencing laws. Again, what you were involved with when you're 18, 19, 20, you are a very different person by the time you're 35. And so states are saying, we should have some kind of mechanism or provision where we can review the sentencing and in the context of the young person and how they have matured since, and doesn't guarantee a release, of course, but would that make sense to at least have that opening and to do it in a way that is cognizant of their developmental stage at the time of an offense and now. So those are the different buckets. The learning community thought it was important to examine the practices, and again, courts, probation, and correctional units. To date, there has not been a ton of research on emerging adults in the justice system, largely because the US has not recognized this as a distinct developmental stage and has automatically lumped emerging adults in with older adults in the justice system. But there is research in a number of fields like neurobiology, developmental psychology, sociology, for example, that can and should inform the development of these practices. The learning community thought it was important to try to provide guidance to jurisdictions that are embarking on the creation of specialized practices. They wanted to ask and wanted to examine what is important. What are the key ingredients of a specialized court or probation department or a correctional unit? They sought out the answers in these 3 papers that will be available today, and we'll put a link to those in the chat shortly. And as you'll see in the papers, each of the papers does have an emphasis on looking at racial inequities. The learning community asks, do special practices exacerbate or address inequities? And the learning community is really urging jurisdictions to partner with researchers and to funders to support this research so that we have that information going forward. Final note is that these papers do not cover everything, but they do reflect the experiences, the expertise, and the wisdom of the learning community members. They are a product of an amazing collaborative process, and we are so thankful to all the learning community members for their work. If you're interested in sort of seeing who all the members are, please visit the website, which is eajustice.org, and there's a special page for learning community members. You can see the full names of everybody and their bios, but obviously appreciate everyone's input. I want to introduce, though, some of the learning community members that have joined us today on this webinar. The first is Judge Edwina Richardson Mendelson, who's going to be our facilitator today and have our opening remarks. And she's going to be joined with panelists of Katie Miller, who's the Chief Probation Officer in San Francisco's Juvenile Probation Department, Frankie Guzman, the Director of the Youth Justice Initiative at the National Center for Youth Law. Also, we have Quincy Booth, the Director of the District of Columbia's Department of Corrections, and Tyrone Walker, an associate at the Justice Policy Institute. We're going to have at the very end of the panel, we are going to be joined by Bruce Western, who's a co-director of the Justice Lab, who's going to offer some sort of concluding remarks. But needless to say, we're thrilled to have all of you here, and I pass it off to Edwina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lael. Frankie, if you're not on screen, please join us on screen. So hello, everyone. I'm really happy to moderate today's expert panel, where I will be joining you in the privilege of learning from my remarkable colleagues, Katie, Frankie, Quincy, and Tyrone, who all bring unique professional as well as lived expertise in the emerging adult justice space. Now, note, I called them by their first names and not by titles or other identifying designations, as that is how we operated during our time together in that learning community, and I am continuing that practice with pleasure. Our panelists hail from different parts of the country and from different walks of life, and it was indeed true joy to spend time with such wonderful thought leaders in our emerging adult justice learning community. I miss them. I miss learning from them and being with them, as we did frequently during our time together. So the work that has been done in that space was, I consider, quite the defining experience for me in the work that I do in New York State. It is clear to me that the work product that we're going to discuss today, these key element brief papers, which were issued on specialized courts, probation, and correctional units, they were all innovative and will have great and lasting impact. But for those of us with the privilege of participating in the learning community, it was the process that was so remarkable that I will treasure always. In New York, we are beginning to pay great attention to the emerging adult justice population, having only recently raised our age of criminal responsibility to 18 in October of 2019. But we recognize that our guiding brain and other science, as Lael mentioned just a few minutes ago, it calls upon us to apply these principles beyond age 18. With the support and guidance of the Columbia Justice Lab and the experts they've introduced us to, we in New York have a number of new emerging adult court endeavors as well as other practices that we're exploring, and they're in different pockets of our state. And the scholars are still supporting us in this work, and they've given us with these three working papers, with these three papers, they have given us a template for our work. And the application of what we developed during that time in our learning community to our actual work in the justice system, that is real and that is rich. So let's move on to the discussion. As has been mentioned, the work product, three remarkable pieces of scholarly work, learning community brief papers, and we use the word brief because they don't cover everything, but their topics are specialized courts, probation, and correctional units. And I have a few questions for our panelists that I expect will bring life, bring these papers and what we discussed in our process to life, and highlight the scholarship and the findings that we made as we engaged in our work together. So I'm going to start with Katie. Catherine Weinstein Miller, who now serves as Chief Probation Officer for San Francisco's Juvenile Probation Department. Katie had a different job when we gathered together in our learning community. And my first question for you, Katie, and you're going to talk to us about specialized courts. How did your jurisdiction gauge readiness to start this initiative, this new way of working with emerging adults?
Well, thank you, Edwina, and thank you, everybody. It's amazing to be back here. I have nostalgia for being with everybody who's here in this webinar, and I have huge nostalgia for my work in the DA's office and for our young adult court because I'm not there anymore. So I feel very blessed to be here today. And I'll answer the question and I'll give a little brief kind of tie-in to the brief as well. So we started our young adult court in 2015 in San Francisco. I don't know if we gauged readiness as much as we gauged need. So what we saw was, you know, young adults hugely disproportionately represented in our adult justice system and incredible stark racial inequities. And we saw really bad outcomes for our youngest adults, for our emerging adults in the adult system. And so the way that we gauged readiness was that we had kind of a small group of us across systems who knew we wanted to try something different. We already had the benefit of specialized probation for young adults here in San Francisco, something that Frankie will be touching about probation. And we had the emerging brain science, right? We were beginning to understand how what we were learning about kind of neuroscience could inform our work, and of course also about trauma. We literally did three things. We brought together kind of a group of people to talk about what was possible in just a limited beginning way, right? One courtroom, one afternoon a week, a limited number of cases. We developed what felt like some very preliminary structure and legal eligibility for our court. And we took a small grant that we had had for many years in San Francisco that we were using for drug buy-bust operations for the very failed war on crime and war on drugs. And we instead decided to just, all of us, change the way we were spending that money and use it to seed this new program. But what I think is important about it is that we kind of jumped into this leap of faith moment without all of the details and elements we have today. And I highlight that because there's never like the right moment where you feel like you have all your ducks in a row. So we kind of knew a little bit, we started, and I will take that now quickly to kind of the elements in the paper, right? Because they show you where we got today, but it's not where we were when we started. And I really want jurisdictions to know that when they're gauging readiness. So, you know, as we talk about, 5 years later for us, we have 130 graduates. Almost everybody, 80% come through without ever having any kind of a conviction, no record. And our focus is on felonies and serious felonies because that's who's in our jail for young adults here in San Francisco. But the elements that we've really discovered over time are four. From the beginning, we knew we really wanted to be developmentally informed and really focus on engaging our young adults. They are right there on the team. They are figuring out their own goals. Those goals are dynamic because they are dynamic at this age in their lives in particular. We change things all the time. They want to change things. And of course, for us, we look at it through the lens of trauma and being trauma informed. We have a very heavy focus on process. Words matter in our court. So we use very active language. We talk about participants, not defendants. Engagement, not compliance, right? Response, not sanctions. Again, that very engaging language. And of course, really focus on the principles of procedural justice. We want our young people to experience this as a place of government legitimacy. And then we focus on confidentiality. It's a safe space where people can be honest and vulnerable because we know we need that for growth. We also have built from the beginning and over time even more connections to community resources that are relevant to our young people, that are developmentally aligned with their needs, but most importantly, that outlive us when they've moved on from the court, because we don't want to be their answer. We want them to find that in community. And then, you know, we've really made sure from the beginning that we developed a really strong legal outcome for our young people. So as I said at the outset, almost everybody leaves our court without any criminal record. And that's important. It's much easier sometimes when you're young and impulsive to take that plea to get out of custody or to just move on with your life. And we really want to offer a very big legal incentive at the end for our young people to succeed, as well as a lot of incentives along the way to really celebrate their progress and celebrate good decision making and growth. Because in the end, I think we all collectively agree here in San Francisco that fostering that growth and connecting our emerging adults to opportunities through the court, it makes our community stronger and safer, and it advances racial equity, as Lael was saying, in a way that's really important to all of us. So we started with a seed, we're still growing, we're kind of like our emerging adults day by day, and I'm really grateful to be a part of it and have been a part of it here. Edwina, you are muted.
It muted me without me touching a button, and I'm not going to comment on that. I'm going to turn now, thank you, Katie. I'm going to turn now to probation, and we will hear from Frankie. Frankie, based on your experience, and you do have unique experience, and your experience with the emerging best practices in community supervision, tell us, we mentioned that this report is brief, we said that deliberately. Is there anything you find missing from the report?
Yeah, well, thank you, Edwina. You know, and I just want to acknowledge if it's missing from the report, I think it's likely a function of lack of research or even emphasis in terms of the culture of probation and criminology and life course criminology. One thing that I found that was present throughout was a tremendous emphasis on employment, as if, you know, getting a job is somehow gonna cure the person of whatever issues are affecting them. And I'll just say from my experience and working with thousands of young people in this age group, I think culture and identity are extremely important, especially as young people are developing a sense of self, oftentimes gravitating towards, you know, what we consider negative peer groups or antisocial behaviors. It's important that we root our responses in identity, in culture, and culturally rooted healing. And I think that is something that is missing both from the research as well as from this issue brief. And I think that it's also particularly important as we consider that the large majority of young people that are on probation are Black, Latino, and other racial minorities, and the system itself is oftentimes administered by predominantly white culture, right? And so there is that disconnect. And if we seek to create connections between, you know, the system and the individuals we serve, we need to pay greater attention and emphasis to the role that identity formation, culture play in developing a young person and helping them to desist from crime and engage in positive and healthy lifestyles. And related to that, I would say is also greater emphasis on engaging community members with lived experience. That is, you know, credible messengers, you know, people with, you know, former gang backgrounds or other experiences that, you know, kids can view as role models, and, you know, somebody that lived that life that they can identify with and see themselves becoming, as opposed to always relying on, you know, law enforcement to be both the mentor, the therapist, the, you know, all things to the young person, which just is not effective, and the data show that. So, you know, with that comment, I'll just say, you know, what we know based on, you know, the research that we do have, you know, approximately 1 million people on probation in the US are emerging adults, or said differently, about 1 in 4 people under probation supervision in the United States are an emerging adult. Emerging adulthood is oftentimes marked by a turbulent transition from adolescent to adult, and with, you know, changes in needs, capacities, and characteristics. And this transition challenges probation departments that are designed with older adults in mind. And so, you know, in involvement with typical probation departments, which often prioritize surveillance and compliance over individual growth and development, it doesn't serve the needs of this emerging adult population very well, especially when, you know, we do experience a lot of reoffending and violation of conditions at much higher rates for this population. So by acknowledging and supporting the neurological, psychosocial, and life course development that occurs during emerging adulthood, probation can better help young people transition into healthy, stable, self-sufficient, law-abiding adulthood, and avoid many of the consequences of incarceration and system involvement. And so the brief covers 4 models, or, you know, just programs. Really, it's 5. 1 in Harris County, 2 in Massachusetts, which includes Boston and the Merrimack Valley, New York City, New York, and San Francisco, California. In the most general terms, and to varying degrees, most of these programs serve older adolescents, age 16 to 25. They have smaller caseloads that are focused on risk and risky behavior using so-called validated risk and or needs assessments, develop individualized treatment plans that are also focused on risks, have specialized probation units with probation officers that are trained in adolescent development, incentives-based supports and responses that include early termination for the young person from probation, as well as an emphasis, as I mentioned before, on education and employment services and partnerships with courts, district attorney's office, law enforcement agencies, and community-based service providers. And that's the models that are featured. But in terms of what the research tells us, and I think that there are elements in the programs I just described that are really focused on having a theory of change that is really focused on the belief that young people can change and will change through seeing the fruits of their own actions, along with positive reinforcement for making good choices. And this theory of change should drive probation, hiring, training, and oversight of probation personnel. And pretty much every other element should also be rooted in this theory of change. And I'll say differently. Training isn't going to improve your probation department. Your philosophical outlook on who you're working and what the goals are need to change from compliance to positive development, right? But the other elements include, forging community partnerships to provide opportunities for growth and connection within the community that the young person will ultimately remain in. Exercising parsimony in sentencing for emerging adults, greater use of diversion, and preventing the undue expansion of probation and its reach. There's this net widening idea, right? It's so great that we're going to put every kid on probation. We don't want that. Shrinking caseloads and case lengths. So again, this idea of we divert low-level young people, and with the limited number of young people that remain, we have smaller caseloads where we can focus more intensively on their needs and their development. Individualizing treatment and our responses to the unique needs such as maturity, histories of trauma, and mental health needs that the young person has. Being improvement and goal-based and not sanction-based. So having goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Focusing on strengths and not deficits, which I think is also, a culture problem that we have. We respond to the negative and don't really play up the positive when we know that our young people have a lot of positives that we oftentimes don't recognize or acknowledge enough. And the use of careful responses to non-compliance, with the idea that, because we know that these young people are growing and this is a turbulent time in adulthood, transition to adulthood can be chaotic. Young people are gonna mess up. And so we should expect that their progress to adulthood should be nonlinear, and our responses should be used as teaching opportunities, not as opportunities to punish. And to conclude, I'll just end, fixing probation isn't going to cure all of the issues with our criminal justice system. So specialized probation units should be adopted in tandem with other reform efforts that include policing, prosecution, sentencing, and reentry, with the goal of supporting young people involved in the system through healthy development to become independent, productive adults. Thank you, Luna.
Thanks so much, Frankie. That was wonderful. We're going to move now to a question, or it's probably going to be a compound question since I've got two experts talking to us about corrections. I've got Quincy Booth, who's the director for the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C.'s Department of Correction. And I've also got Tyrone Walker, who is an associate at Justice Policy Institute and also a former mentor in the Young Men Emerging Unit at the DC Jail. So I need to know more about this Young Men Emerging Unit, the YME, what inspired the Department of Corrections in the District of Columbia to create this, and magic wand time. I have a magic wand that I allow others to borrow on occasion, and I am letting you borrow my useful magic wand. What is the one thing you would change about the YME unit if you had the ability to do so? So however you chose to divide answering those questions, have at it.
Thank you, Edwina. Well, if I had the ability with this wand to change things, wow, man, what would I change? I guess I would want to change, literally want to change the emerging adults to grow faster and learn more quicker. Because we know that this is a high flying population that comes in and out of the system. And so with creating the unit, and while I was a mentor there, we really thanked Quincy and his team for bringing the model there and giving us a chance, who were emerging adults when we went into the system, to actually play a role in giving back to those who were coming into the system. And not only like teach them how to navigate the life courses and the skills that they would need to stay out of the prison system, but also we also knew that all of them wasn't going to be able to be released because some of them have serious charges, and that they allow us to bring other emerging adults on the unit who were going into the federal system. And we really felt that we had something more to teach them as mentors in the unit. It was like collectively, we had over 120 years on the unit of time served. And so we were able to teach those skills to the emerging adults, that when they went into the deep end of the system, hey, these are the skills that you're going to need to survive on the deep end of the system, but also these are the skills that you can use to help you become a better person ultimately when you get into the community. That is what's missing from the paper for me. As as Frankie mentioned, the culture and identity was very important. But Katie also mentioned something that was very important too, which is the liberty. The young people in the unit had a chance to shape the unit that they were living on. And we have the director here, Quincy Booth, to thank for that.
Well, thank you, Tyrone, and thank you to my other teammates. And I do miss being in person with you. Collectively, I will echo what everyone else said, but just putting it in the context of what Tyrone mentioned, sort of what inspired us was really, and I'm not saying this in any order, one was the data and the other was our heart, right? And so we have to understand in this work and being public servants, it's to serve people, and it's not oftentimes what's in the best interest of yourselves that oftentimes we show up to work with, but what's in the best interest of the individuals that you are responsible for and serving. And so the data revealed a lot of things that our young people needed collectively, across the board. So from mentoring to education to health needs, you name it, the normal things that you and I collectively needed at that age, or what we actually need now, we were able to provide. And I would often say, and I'm being limited on time because I don't want Edwina to cut me off, And so again, what I will offer is that I am here if people have additional questions beyond, and I think collectively, I'll speak for the group, we are collectively here if people have additional questions. So I'm really giving you bullet points, as it relates to this. But long and short is that I don't like to refer to it as a program. It was really a community that we fostered that was rooted in love, that was rooted in an ability for people to heal, and was rooted, as my good friend Frankie stated, identity that was shaped by the individuals on the unit. And when I say individuals, from mentors like Tyrone to mentees, and also mentors like the young men that were in the age range to 18 to 25, but then also the officers, as well as the case managers and our other health staff members that were there. And so, again, I sort of went in one day and said, hey, this was sort of my vision, but I'm not going to tell you all how to come up with it and how to make it. I respect that you all know what you need, and you all will come up with the idea of what it is. And I had several folks looking at me like I was crazy because this was sort of foreign, in the space of government as a whole, and even corrections, right? Because generally corrections, it's very much a paramilitary environment, and it's sort of do A, B, C, D. And again, I more so just gave a blank canvas and said, make it work, right? And so it was stop and start, stop and start, stop and start. And so we had the opportunity, as listed in the paper, and thanks to Lael and the team, of going and visiting and having conversations, mainly with the Chesser, because they actually had it up and running. And so it was an opportunity for us to visualize and dream on one hand, but then actually go and see. And so there was one time that we actually went to visit and folks were like, yes, I'm ready to go. They came back and started to do the work. And then they were like, wait, there's a stumbling block, because they incorporated new people into the fold. And it was still sort of a pause. And people said, I just don't understand, because conceptually, mainly our officers, I think the residents that are in our care, the mentors and the mentees, they had a path forward, right, to some degree. But some of the officers just got stuck because historically, this is not the way in which they were accustomed to doing business, right? And so it was an opportunity for them to go back again and see it. And I never forget that evening, because they went out one day early in the morning and came back that evening. And I was receiving emails from staff members saying, aha, I now understand, because they had to see it. It's okay to dream, but sometimes you have to have that validation, as well. And so I would say, long and short, that's what inspired me. We still have it today, and it is modified by virtue of the posture that we're in as it relates to COVID. But what I will say, and I'll stop on time because I know I don't want to get the hammer. If I could sort of do your magic wand and thank you for that, I wouldn't necessarily say I would change anything, with the exception of I would love for the exposure to be a little bit different as it relates to, we open this up to community, as Frankie mentioned, and not just members of their families, because we generally had visitation that was a family visitation, but we also opened it up to judges and other community members. And so what they then had the opportunity to see is people for their humanity of who they really are, as opposed to who they label them to be, right? And so you have individuals now going off to college, going from GED to college while in a jail setting. And some judges were just sort of perplexed by that, to say, I never knew this is who you were, right? And it was more so some of the response from some of our residents said, well, you never asked the question, you just talked to me as opposed to engaging. And so I felt like in an indirect way, it's helped in some regards. And so I would have loved to just expose the space a little bit more. And I would say, not necessarily a young man emerging throughout the facility, because that's a question that we get often all the time, but really what I would say is really customizing the right people, going back to Frankie's point, because there's some folks that we definitely know should not necessarily be in our care, but for those who have to be for serious offenses, have to be in our care, customizing services so they can continue to grow, to dream, and have the framework that they need to be successful and go back into the community.
Thank you, Tyrone, and thank you, Quincy. I have to take a pause there and appreciate the power of a corrections leader using words that the work is rooted in love. That was very powerful, and so I'm putting a pin in it. Katie, I'm coming back to you, and I have to know what the reaction was of your office at the time, as well as the community justice system partners, to this new work and this new way of thinking of things. And since you have such limited time to talk about that, also any last thoughts that you may wish for us to know?
Sure. I think what I would quickly say is I was apprehensive about what the reaction of the DA's office would be, and the justice partners generally, and the community, right? We were handling very serious and violent cases differently than we ever had before in our justice system for the most impulsive age group. And I think the best summarization I can give is that one of the attorneys in our office, as we were planning, came to me to ask if he could be the attorney who actually did our young adult court. And he was the head of our homicide unit. He was a former LA police officer. He was a man of color. And he felt like all he saw as the head of homicide were different outcomes. And he wanted to be somewhere he could make a difference. And he took it on in addition to his work. I think that set the tone for our office. But even beyond that, I will tell you, we've had a wait list of cases since we opened 5 years ago. So collectively, all the justice system partners really welcomed it as meeting a real need for young people. And I think the last thing I would say then, Edwina, because I'm trying really hard to be good about time, is, what I want everyone to hear in these conversations is that what we're talking about is normal, right? Young adult development, emerging adult development. My hope is that these kinds of models don't convey a message that we look at young people involved in our justice system as different, but that it's normalizing. My oldest son turned 18 on Friday. I have a young adult in my house now, right? This is normal. This is what he's also like right now. So, that's the greatest hope to me, is that as we talk about things this way, it sends a message, not that our kids in the justice system are different or should be feared.
Thanks so much, Katie. Frankie, you did such a good job of outlining the principles in that in our paper about specialized probation. And you've also highlighted for us some of the pitfalls that we should be looking out for. Can you leave us with one overarching principle regarding specialized justice initiatives as they relate to probation that you'd like us to be left with, as well as any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
Sure. I just want to start off by saying I think that every community member is valuable, and we all have something to contribute. But it's been my experience that we often designate or otherwise just delegate the work to probation or law enforcement to do the things that the community should be doing. And while I wish that more people were like Quincy, and we have some awesome chiefs in California, probation chiefs who do good work, Katie being one of them. It is like anything else, if you don't have the vision, the skills, the experience, you're going to do poorly at community inclusion, at diversifying your investments in terms of where the limited resources should go. And I think that the more we have multi-stakeholders making decisions, allowing the educators to make decisions around education, allowing the medical professionals to make decisions about health-based approaches, and not allowing probation or courts or whoever else, the sheriff in terms of county jails, to be the gatekeeper, that type of culture has, I think, really hindered our ability to move towards progress. And it's always just very incremental progress when we have the knowledgeable, the wise, the leader, but there are too few and too far in between. And so I think rather than hoping that we get that Quincy or that Katie to run our system, we should have a more diverse approach, a diversified approach to decision making, to equitable, let's just say, funding, allowing community to contribute their expertise, because otherwise what we have is distrustful law enforcement saying, not that CBO, because those people I don't trust. I want this one over here that the kids have no connection to and don't really validate, or approaches that are really rooted in distrust or let's just say punishment as opposed to love. And so I still have to say, let's not just defer to one entity or one agency, believing that they can be the silver bullet for all. So even as we improve probation, let's be sure to not make too much of it, because we still need educators and social workers and medical personnel and people with lived experience like Tyrone to have an equal seat at the table, to have equitable resourcing and funding and decision making around how they approach and engage these young people, and no more gatekeeping, because that I think has been harmful.
So Frankie, we hear your points about shared responsibility and the importance of community and inclusion. Thank you for that. And so Tyrone and Quincy, I just want you to be able to tell us in less than a minute each, so we can have a few questions, and Leah will help us with those. Some last thoughts. What would you like for us to know? What do you want to leave us with?
Thank you, Edwin. I'll just be brief and just say that anyone or any state that's looking, or county that's looking to embark on this work of a specialized correctional unit, you got to make it work for where you are. All right. We did it different in DC, but I can tell you this, as being someone who was actually in the unit as a mentor, the relationship really worked, and it was a proxy that we work with leadership. The mentors work with the leadership because, like, our emerging adults were still on the time that, they polices, they couldn't see past that. But we was able to help inform the work and vice versa, and it gave it such a plush that they just actually bought into it. They bought into it, and they started to see that, hey, I too can be this. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyrone. Credible messengers. That's what you're talking about as the connection between the community you were serving as well as the correctional leaders.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Quincy.
So just echoing, so just remembering, one, as I stated earlier, you're a servant, and sometimes your ego may get in the way. And sometimes you have to, not sometimes, but if you really want things to be successful, put your ego aside, increase your heart, be intentional around what you do. Words matter, and you have to start. It will never be perfect because we're not perfect people, but you should start, be intentional again about your efforts. And as things move along, you make the modifications, you make the tweaks, but it should be rooted in the individuals that you're responsible for serving. And so if you don't incorporate their voice in the equation as an equal partner in this work, it's like going to a restaurant and someone just flops something down on your plate, on your table, and you're like, this is not what I ordered. I'm actually allergic to this, as opposed to providing someone with, hey, I would actually like A, B, and C, because then it will be more accepted in the long run. And as Tyrone mentioned a little bit earlier, we remain here if you need anything, and all the best. Oh, I'm sorry. One last thing. This should not be the destination, right? Because that's the one thing that we fear sort of in this work, is that many of our partners will then say, hey, we're going to send them to the jail to get this respective programming. And I believe wholeheartedly that should be the last destination. Even if it's specialized, these should be the same sort of models that are out in the community, as well. And that's the balance that you have to play. You should not have anything on the deep end that you actually don't have on the front end, because you create an unintended consequence, in my opinion.
Really important point. Thank you so much. So Lael, help us with questions.
Sure. I think we're going to may have time for just 2 questions, which is too hard because you have some great questions out here. But I'm going to pose one question which came in the Q&A, which is to do with gender and gender differences. We talk about young men emerging unit. Do any of you have experience working with young women? Is the experience similar, or does the practice need to change? And I would say just in the papers, this specialized correction paper does note that there is a unit in Connecticut called the Worth Unit, which is focused just on young women, but that most of the units that we looked at and studied were for men. Most of the population is male, but still, great question. We have women at both probation, courts, corrections. What is the approach and what are the differences?
I can speak for a minute about court. So about 20% of the young people in our young adult court are women. And I would say that the biggest challenges that we are seeing and trying to support them with that's different than the young men in our court are a much larger percentage are parents. And a lot of them are in very violent relationships. And so really working through kind of intimate partner violence and family violence, and the housing instability that's come from that for them has been one of the biggest challenges that our judge actually talks about quite often. And it was something that I think caught a lot of the folks starting off the court by surprise, just how pervasive it translated into that housing instability for them too.
Bill, I just want to also give a kind of a plug for, I work at the National Center for Youth Law, and we have projects around the country, but one site where we work is in Santa Clara County here in the Silicon Valley. And Santa Clara County, the court probation has partnered with my office, the National Center for Youth Law, and Vera and others around a collective impact project to get girl incarceration to 0. And that is in the juvenile context, but we partnered with an organization, Young Women's Freedom Center, and others who are able to really bring their expertise, young women who have experienced the system, to be kind of the architects of this approach. And I will say that the needs oftentimes, or the issues that affect the girls in this community tend to be with things that are uniquely make them vulnerable, like, having parents that don't approve of their lifestyle, their foster youth status, being exploited by men in terms of sexual exploitation, housing issues, housing instability, and the paternalism that the system has. It's better to lock this girl up than to do something else that's more responsible. It's kind of one element. Another thing that I want to mention is that currently my office is also leading a bill, AB 124, which would allow courts to consider greater evidence of trauma, sexual exploitation, sexual violence, in decision making around charging, sentencing, and the ability to strike enhancements. And all that because I just want to acknowledge that our courts were created by men, for men, and oftentimes we don't recognize the differences in power dynamic and in culture in terms of how we treat boys differently from girls and the needs of young women. And we're trying to update our course to do that. And so I think all of this is still work in progress. There's not really like takeaways that I can say, except to say definitely the needs, the challenges are different. But I think a big part of it is.
Frankie, that hammer is here.
Sorry, Edwina.
Found it, and what you said was so rich. I don't want to cut you off, but I have to because we're actually going to have to stop with just that one question. But I also have to give a shout out to Westchester County, New York, where the administrative judge, Kathy Davidson, has been leading some remarkable work in her community as a judicial leader, working with community-based organizations and researchers to address girls and young women in New York State. So there is work and there's room to recognize those differences that Frankie just so eloquently highlighted. Leo, I think we must turn this over now to the remarkable Bruce Western to close us out.
Thanks so much, Edwina. What a great conversation. It reminds me of when we're all able to meet together in person, and I'm feeling very, very nostalgic for that right now. I want to begin by acknowledging Lael's extraordinary leadership of the emerging adult learning community. I think she, more than anyone, has really created a national movement around a justice process for young people. And it's just been wonderful to have learned so much also from John Laub, Edwina and Katie and Quincy and Tyrone and Frankie over the years. It's really been a privilege to work with them. So in a period of life course transition from adolescence to adulthood, I think the fundamental question that we're discussing today is how can families, communities, and public policy best support a safe landing place for young people who have come into conflict with the law and who may have harmed others. And I think this is one of the fundamental questions that run through our discussion today of specialized courts and community supervision and corrections. And of course, we don't approach this question in a social vacuum. By the time young people reach the courts, significant racial disparity has already emerged. The footprint of the criminal justice system, particularly for young people, falls overwhelmingly on low-income communities of color. The challenges of life course transition, leaving school, finding work, are even more difficult in communities that have years of disinvestment behind them and a criminal justice system that itself has become a significant obstacle to social mobility and life success. Part of the challenge, I reckon, of the current discussion is that the criminal justice system isn't just unresponsive to the particular challenges of life transitions. It's that the criminal justice system often functions as an on-ramp to sustained criminal justice involvement. So youthful misdemeanors turn into jail stays, which evolve into felony charges and then ultimately state prison. And all of the work that we've heard about today is intended to offer off-ramps instead of on-ramps. The EAJ court proposal and the work that Katie described in the DA's office in San Francisco puts respect for young people at the center of the work, having a voice in courts, procedural fairness, perhaps a different model of accountability that involves actively acknowledging harm and repairing that harm. Probation is built around an intensive, rehabilitative, bundle of services, individualized treatment, sparing use of punishment for non-compliance. And Frankie spoke eloquently to that. And finally, incarceration. There are experiments going around the country that are attempting to provide a much richer programming environment that emphasizes education as well as behavioral health, different kind of correctional culture inside the institution that's less authoritarian, and mentoring that Tyrone spoke about, involving older credible messengers that are not unlike community-based anti-violence efforts that are happening around the country now. It's interesting as I think about EAJ in the context of the larger conversation about justice that's evolved very quickly over the last 4 years. As we talk about justice writ large, particularly this week with everything that's happened in Minneapolis, racial justice is now at the center of the conversation, and non-criminal justice alternatives to responding to interpersonal violence in particular. This occupies a large part of the debate. So I wonder if the next chapter of EAJ's work involves a more fundamental reimagination of successful pathways to adulthood. There's the normalization that Katie spoke about. And maybe there's a fourth leg of the stool beyond the courts, beyond community supervision and incarceration, a fourth leg of the stool to talk about, and that's the role of community groups. Lael spoke about this in her introductory remarks, and Quincy spoke about it too. Could we imagine a non-court process that provides a sense of safety and accountability for people that have been harmed? This is what Frankie called a culture of healing, I think. Could we imagine a type of community engagement that is multi-generational in the way that Tyrone described, and affirming for young people, but also helps young people discharge the debts that they accrue when they've caused harm to other people? Could such a process empower communities and allow them to be the authors of their own safety? In many ways, I think the emerging adult work has only just begun. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.